poor cleaner spent her very last dollar to buy bread for a complete stranger. Everyone thought she was foolish. Some even laughed as she walked away with an empty pocket and no money left to feed herself. But what nobody inside that supermarket knew was that the quiet old man she had just helped was hiding a secret worth billions. He wasn't poor. He wasn't helpless. He was one of the richest billionaires in America, and after witnessing a kindness so pure that money could never buy, he made a life-changing decision that would shock an entire city. Who was this mysterious billionaire? Why was one of the wealthiest men in the country pretending to be an ordinary stranger? And how could one loaf of bread become the beginning of the most unexpected love story either of them had ever imagined? Stay with us until the very end, because every twist that follows is more unbelievable, more emotional, and more heartbreaking than the first rays of sunlight stretched across Brookhaven City as people rushed to begin another busy weekday. Cars filled the streets, buses stopped every few minutes, and office workers hurried past one another without exchanging more than a glance. Among the crowd walked a young woman wearing a faded blue supermarket uniform. Her name was Emily Carter. At 25 years old, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the hardships that had become part of her daily life. The cleaning cart she pushed was old, one of its wheels squeaking every few feet, yet she never complained. She simply adjusted her grip and kept moving. Most customers who saw Emily assumed she had always been a cleaner. None of them knew that just 3 years earlier she had proudly walked across a university stage to receive a business administration degree with honors. Back then, hope had filled her heart. She still remembered her late father clapping louder than everyone else during her graduation ceremony. "Go further than I ever did," he had whispered as he hugged her tightly. That memory remained one of the last happy moments they shared together. Only 4 months after graduation, her father suffered a massive heart attack while working overtime as an electrician. He never made it to the hospital. His death shattered the Carter family overnight. Medical bills consumed every dollar they had saved. The modest family car was sold. Her father's tools disappeared one by one. Even Emily's graduation laptop had been sold just to keep the lights on. Each sacrifice bought them only a little more time. The dream she had built throughout college slowly disappeared beneath unpaid bills and rejection letters. More than 200 job applications had produced nothing except polite emails thanking her for applying. Companies wanted experience she didn't have. Others hired relatives of senior staff instead. Eventually, survival became more important than ambition. That was how Emily accepted the only position available: cleaner. The salary barely covered rent and groceries. Most months it wasn't enough still. It was honest work. Inside Green Valley Supermarket, Emily greeted everyone with the same gentle smile she offered every morning. "Good morning, Mrs. Lopez." Elderly bakery worker smiled warmly. "Morning, sweetheart. You're here early again. I like getting the floors done before customers arrive." Lopez nodded. "You always work harder than anyone here." Emily laughed softly. "Just try to do my best." Unknown to Emily, those simple words would later become important. Small moments often reveal the biggest truths about a person's character. Near the front entrance, another employee rolled his eyes. "Too nice, Tyler," one of the stock clerks muttered while stacking canned goods. Emily smiled. "It doesn't cost anything to be kind," Tyler chuckled. "One day someone's going to take advantage of that kindness." Emily simply continued mopping. She had heard similar warnings countless times. But bitterness had never appealed to her. She believed kindness was not a weakness. It was a choice. A choice her mother had taught her long before life became difficult. Across the city, the contrast could not have been greater. Behind tall iron gates surrounded by beautifully landscaped gardens stood Harrison Manor, one of the largest private estates in Brookhaven. Inside the mansion, priceless artwork decorated polished walls. Crystal chandeliers reflected the morning sunlight. Luxury cars rested silently inside a climate-controlled garage. The home belonged to Richard Harrison. At 62 years old, Richard had built Harrison Global Holdings into one of the country's largest real estate and construction companies. His investments stretched across hotels, hospitals, commercial buildings, and technology firms. Financial magazines regularly ranked him among America's wealthiest businessmen. People admired his success. Few understood his loneliness. 5 years earlier, cancer had taken his wife, Margaret. No business victory had ever eased that loss. The mansion remained magnificent, but without Margaret's laughter echoing through its halls, it often felt empty. Money had given Richard almost everything, except the one thing he wanted most: more time with the woman he loved. His son, Daniel Harrison, entered the dining room carrying a digital tablet. "Morning, Dad." Richard looked up and smiled faintly. "Morning." Daniel noticed the untouched breakfast. "Hardly eaten. I'm not very hungry." Daniel sat opposite him, still thinking about Mom. Richard remained silent for several seconds. The answer was obvious. Finally, he nodded. A day goes by. Daniel lowered his eyes. He missed her too. Margaret Harrison had been known throughout the company for remembering employees by name. She believed wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to improve other people's lives. Richard often wondered if she had been the best part of him. After another quiet moment, Richard spoke again. "Daniel." "Yes." "When was the last time someone treated me like an ordinary man?" Daniel frowned. "Not sure I understand." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Everywhere I go, people stand before I even reach the table. They laugh at jokes that aren't funny. They agree with everything I say. Never know who's being genuine." Daniel nodded slowly. It wasn't the first time his father had voiced that concern. Years of extraordinary success had made authentic relationships increasingly rare. Richard looked toward the garden. "Miss the days when your mother and I had nothing." Daniel smiled. "Never said that before. We're happier." "You also worked 18 hours a day." Richard laughed quietly. "I did." She still insisted on walking with me to the neighborhood grocery store every Saturday. A brief moment, Richard saw those memories as clearly as if they had happened yesterday. Margaret laughing, holding his hand, arguing playfully over which bread tasted better. Simple moments money could never replace. "Want one ordinary day?" Richard finally said. Daniel looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "I want to leave this house dressed like everyone else. No assistants, no reporters, no luxury cars. I want people to treat me the way they treat any stranger." Daniel immediately shook his head. "Dad, that's risky." Richard smiled knowingly. "I expected you to say that." Minutes later, they met with Thomas Brooks, the longtime head of security. Thomas listened carefully before responding. "Sir, I strongly advise against walking around completely alone." Richard folded his arms. "I'm not asking for permission." Thomas sighed. "I know." After several moments of thought, Thomas offered a compromise. "My team will remain nearby. You won't see us, won't interfere. We'll monitor your safety from a distance." Richard considered the proposal. That solved the obvious security concern while still allowing him to experience ordinary life. "Deal." Thomas nodded once. "I'll have plainclothes agents positioned several blocks away." Arrangement quietly foreshadowed something important. Although Richard wanted to disappear into the crowd for a single day, he would never truly be unprotected. That decision, made out of caution, would later become one of the most important details in the entire story. Less than an hour later, an ordinary sedan dropped Richard several blocks from downtown before driving away. He wore faded jeans, an old brown jacket, comfortable shoes. A worn flat cap covered most of his gray hair. Without his expensive suits and luxury watch, he looked like any retired man enjoying a walk through the city. No one recognized him. People brushed past without paying attention. For the first time in years, Richard Harrison smiled like a man who had escaped a cage built from wealth. At nearly the same moment, Emily finished polishing the supermarket entrance. Manager Victor Collins walked over with his usual stern expression. "Emily, sir, I expect spotless floors today. They'll be spotless. Don't waste time talking to customers." "I understand." Victor walked away without another glance. Emily quietly returned to work. She didn't resent him. She simply hoped that one day she would find a better job and give her mother the peaceful life she deserved. She had no idea that destiny was already walking toward the supermarket, or that before the day ended, one decision involving a single loaf of bread would change the course of her life forever. The automatic doors of Green Valley Supermarket slid open one after another as customers streamed inside. Shopping carts rattled across the polished floor Emily had spent the last hour cleaning. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted from the bakery section, mixing with the rich aroma of brewed coffee from the small cafe near the entrance. Emily pushed her cleaning cart toward the cereal aisle, quietly mopping around customers as they filled their baskets. It looked like another ordinary morning. But ordinary mornings often become unforgettable without warning. Several blocks away, Richard Harrison walked at an unhurried pace through downtown Brookhaven. For the first time in years, nobody greeted him by name. Nobody rushed to shake his hand. Nobody tried to impress him. He passed construction workers eating breakfast sandwiches, teenagers laughing outside a convenience store, and elderly couples walking hand in hand. He smiled. "So this is what life feels like now," he murmured to himself. Hidden several storefronts away, Thomas Brooks watched from inside an unmarked SUV. Two additional plainclothes security agents blended naturally into the morning crowd. One pretended to read a newspaper outside a coffee shop. Another sat on a nearby bench scrolling through his phone. Their earpieces remained almost invisible. Richard had asked for freedom. Thomas intended to give him freedom, without ever risking his safety. Meanwhile, inside the supermarket, Emily had just finished cleaning the produce section when Mrs. Lopez approached carrying a tray of fresh rolls. "Been working nonstop," the elderly baker said warmly. Emily smiled. "Still got half the store left." Lopez lowered her voice. "Did your mother sleep any better last night?" Emily's smile faded ever so slightly. "A little. The new medication helping?" "I hope so." She didn't mention that there were only 3 pills left, or that she didn't know how she would afford the next prescription. Mrs. Lopez gently squeezed Emily's shoulder. "Things won't stay hard forever." Emily forced another smile. "Pray you're right." As Mrs. Lopez walked away, Emily quietly reached into her pocket. She counted her money beneath the cleaning cart where no one could see. $18. She counted again. Still 18. $6 for the bus home. $8 toward her mother's medication. The remaining $4 would buy bread, eggs, and a carton of milk. Nothing more. She folded the bills carefully and slipped them back into her pocket. That money wasn't just cash. It represented survival. Across the street, Richard noticed the supermarket. His eyes drifted toward a sign advertising freshly baked artisan bread. He smiled to himself. Margaret had loved warm bread. Every Saturday she insisted on buying a fresh loaf, claiming bread tasted different when it came straight from the oven. Richard suddenly found himself missing those mornings more than ever. Almost without thinking, he crossed the street and entered Green Valley Supermarket. The security team quietly adjusted their positions outside. Thomas spoke softly into his microphone. "Everyone stay where you are. No contact unless absolutely necessary." Inside the store, Richard picked up a shopping basket. He wandered slowly through the aisles, enjoying something as simple as choosing groceries without anyone following him. He selected only a loaf of freshly baked sourdough bread, nothing else. As he approached the checkout line, he smiled politely at the young cashier. Her name tag read Melissa. She barely looked up. Next, Richard placed the bread on the counter. Melissa scanned it, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His smile disappeared. He checked the other pocket. Nothing. His jeans, nothing. He frowned gently. Then memory struck. Before leaving the mansion, he had switched jackets. His wallet was still inside the expensive coat hanging back home. For a brief moment, he almost laughed at himself. Margaret would have teased him endlessly for making such a mistake. "I'm terribly sorry," Richard said calmly. "It seems I've forgotten my wallet." Melissa sighed loudly. "So?" Richard smiled apologetically. "I honestly didn't realize until just now." Customers behind him shifted impatiently. A middle-aged man folded his arms. "Come on, some of us have places to be." Richard nodded politely. "I understand." Turning back to Melissa, he said, "If you'll allow me a few minutes, I can call someone to bring payment." Melissa rolled her eyes. "We don't hold groceries." "I understand. I'm simply asking for a little time." Irritation on Melissa's face grew. "We hear this excuse every day." Richard blinked. "Excuse me, I forgot my wallet. My friend is coming." "I'll pay tomorrow." She folded her arms. "It never happens." Richard remained remarkably calm. "I assure you I'm telling the truth." Another customer muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. If you can't afford bread, why are you shopping? Several people chuckled. Richard lowered his eyes briefly, not because he felt ashamed, because he suddenly understood something. If he had truly been poor, this humiliation might have been unbearable. Melissa pushed the loaf aside. Step out of the line. I'm not refusing. I'm simply asking. I said step aside. Her voice grew louder. Heads began turning across the supermarket. Emily heard the raised voices from halfway down the cleaning aisle. She looked toward the checkout area. Something about the old man's posture caught her attention. He wasn't arguing, he wasn't shouting. He simply stood there quietly while everyone spoke over him. She leaned the mop against her cart for some reason. She couldn't look away. Back at the register, Richard tried once more. My phone is also in my other jacket. Melissa gave a sarcastic laugh. Convenient. I know how it sounds. Then leave. Line behind him continued growing. A woman whispered to her husband, he probably does this everywhere. Richard heard every word. Years of success had taught him emotional control. Still, those comments stung more than he expected, not because they were directed at Richard Harrison, but because they were directed at a man everyone believed was poor. And for the first time in decades, people judged him without knowing anything about him. The automatic office door suddenly opened. Manager Victor Collins stepped onto the sales floor. His expression immediately hardened. What's going on here? Melissa pointed toward Richard. This man can't pay. Victor looked Richard up and down, the faded jacket, the worn shoes, the old cap. In his mind, he had already reached a conclusion. Sir, Richard turned politely. If you don't have money, you'll need to leave. Completely understand, Richard replied. I'm simply asking for a few minutes so someone can bring. Victor cut him off. This isn't a waiting area. Richard remained calm. Gladly pay. Victor shook his head. People are waiting. I know. Then stop delaying everyone. Several customers nodded in agreement. Emily had quietly walked closer. She stood near the greeting cards display, listening. Something felt terribly wrong. Richard wasn't acting like someone trying to steal. His voice remained calm. His posture remained respectful. His eyes showed embarrassment, not deception. Victor pointed toward the entrance. You need to leave now. Richard took a slow breath. Lived long enough to know arguments solve very little. He looked at Victor, only asking to be treated fairly. Victor's patience snapped. We've treated you fairly. No, Richard answered softly. Judge me before listening. One brief second, Victor hesitated, but pride is dangerous. Instead of reconsidering, his face hardened further. He looked toward the security guards near the entrance. Escort him outside. Two guards immediately started walking toward Richard. Emily's heartbeat quickened. She glanced at the old man, then at the guards, then at the loaf of bread still resting quietly on the counter. Something inside her refused to let her keep walking away. She slipped one hand into her pocket. Her fingers touched the folded $18, bus fare, medicine, dinner. Her mother's face flashed across her mind. Then another memory appeared. She was 12 years old. Her father had once given his own lunch to a homeless veteran sitting outside a train station. That evening, Emily had asked him why. He smiled and said, kindness costs something, sweetheart. If it costs nothing, it usually isn't kindness. Standing inside Green Valley Supermarket years later, those words echoed louder than ever. She looked at the guards, who were now only a few steps away from the old man. Then she looked down at the money in her hand. One decision would change everything. Emily stared at the folded bills in her trembling hand. $18, that was all she had. She could almost hear the pharmacist apologizing the previous evening. I'm sorry, Emily. We can only hold your mother's prescription until tomorrow. She had smiled politely and promised to return, but deep inside, she hadn't known where the money would come from. Now those same bills rested between her fingers. Bus fare, medicine, food, survival. Only a few feet away, two security guards continued walking toward the elderly man. Around them, customers watched with expressions that ranged from impatience to amusement. Not one person stepped forward. Not one person asked whether the old man was telling the truth. The silence of good people often hurts as much as the cruelty of bad ones. Richard Harrison stood perfectly still. His face remained calm, but inside something had shifted. For decades, he had donated millions to charities that helped struggling families. He believed he understood poverty, but standing there now, dressed like an ordinary man, being dismissed before anyone bothered to hear him, He realized there was a loneliness to humiliation that no amount of money could truly explain. Manager Victor Collins folded his arms. Already told you to leave. Richard nodded respectfully. I heard you. Then why are you still standing here? Because I hoped someone might give me 60 seconds to explain. Victor laughed sarcastically. Already wasted more than 60 seconds. A customer near the back of the line shook his head. People like him always have another excuse. Woman whispered, it's embarrassing. Richard lowered his eyes for only a moment. He wasn't embarrassed for himself. He was saddened by how quickly people assumed the worst. Not far away, Emily's heartbeat pounded so loudly she could barely hear the conversations around her. She looked at the old man again. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't insulted anyone. He hadn't demanded special treatment. He had simply asked to explain. Something about that reminded her of her father. Years earlier, after losing an important construction contract because someone falsely accused him of damaging equipment, her father had come home heartbroken. I wasn't even given a chance to defend myself, he had told his wife that night. Emily had been only 16 then, quietly listening from the hallway. That memory had never left her now. History seemed to be repeating itself before her eyes, only this time. She had the chance to do something. Her fingers tightened around the money. She closed her eyes briefly. If she paid for the bread, her mother would have to wait for her medicine. She might have to walk home instead of taking the bus. She herself would probably go hungry. Logic screamed at her not to do it. Compassion whispered something louder. She slowly stepped forward. Excuse me. The entire checkout area became quiet. Even the security guard stopped walking. Victor frowned. Emily, she swallowed nervously, then looked at Melissa. Much is the bread, Melissa blinked. You, what? How much? $6.79. Emily nodded. Without another word, she unfolded the bills in her hand. She counted them once, then counted again. There was no mistake. Paying for the bread meant rearranging everything she had planned for the day. For a brief moment, she hesitated, not because she didn't want to help, because she knew exactly what helping would cost. Richard watched her silently. He could see the struggle in her eyes. This wasn't easy for her, whatever money she carried. She clearly needed it herself. That realization touched him more deeply than he could explain. Emily looked at the old man. He offered a gentle smile. You don't have to do this. She smiled back. I know. Then she turned toward Melissa. I'll pay. Cashier stared in disbelief. Victor frowned. You don't need to involve yourself. Emily looked at him respectfully. Only buying bread, sir. Victor had no rule that prevented an employee from purchasing groceries. He said nothing. Melissa slowly accepted the money. The register beeped. The receipt printed. She placed the loaf into a paper bag and slid it across the counter. Emily picked it up carefully. She turned toward Richard. Here you go, sir. A moment. Richard couldn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on the young woman standing before him. Her uniform was old, her shoes were worn, her hands carried the faint roughness of someone who worked hard every day. She was clearly not wealthy, yet she had just sacrificed something valuable for a complete stranger. Why? He searched her face for an answer. There was no pride, no expectation, no desire for recognition, only kindness, pure, quiet, selfless kindness. Richard slowly accepted the bread. My dear. His voice caught unexpectedly. Done something extraordinary today. Emily shook her head. Only did what I hoped someone would do for my family. Those words settled deeply inside Richard's heart. He had attended charity galas, award ceremonies, fundraising dinners. He had heard thousands of speeches about compassion. Yet none of them carried the quiet power of that single sentence. Without realizing it, Emily had reminded him of Margaret. His late wife had often said something remarkably similar. We're all one difficult day away from needing someone else's kindness. The first time in 5 years, Richard felt the warmth of that memory without overwhelming grief. Instead, he felt hope. Outside the supermarket, Thomas Brooks watched everything through the glass doors. One of the agents quietly spoke into his earpiece. Sir. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He had seen countless people treat Richard with respect because of his wealth today. Someone had respected him without knowing who he was. That was infinitely more valuable. Inside, Richard reached into his empty pocket instinctively before stopping himself. A faint smile crossed his face. Old habits. He looked back at Emily. Don't even know your name, she smiled gently. Emily. Emily, he repeated it slowly, almost as though committing it to memory. My name is Richard. He intentionally offered only his first name, not because he wanted to deceive her, but because he wanted this moment to remain genuine. "Never forget what you've done," Emily smiled. "You don't owe me anything." Richard looked into her eyes. "I believe I do." Those simple words carried far more meaning than Emily could possibly understand. Melissa broke the silence with a scoff. "I still think she wasted her money." Emily looked toward her. "Maybe. You'll regret it." Emily smiled softly. "I'd regret walking away even more." Several customers lowered their eyes. A few suddenly looked uncomfortable. The woman who had whispered earlier quietly stepped out of line. An older gentleman removed his cap respectfully as Richard walked past him. No one apologized aloud, but guilt had begun spreading through the crowd. Sometimes one act of courage silently exposes everyone else's lack of it. Richard walked toward the automatic doors. Just before stepping outside, he paused. He turned one last time. Emily had already returned to her cleaning cart. As if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if kindness was simply part of who she was, Richard watched her for several seconds. Then he quietly walked outside. Thomas immediately approached, handed him the loaf of bread. "Find out everything about that young woman." Thomas looked surprised. "You mean the employee?" "Yes." Richard's voice softened. "Spent years wondering whether genuine kindness still exists." He looked back through the glass. Emily was mopping the floor exactly where she had been before the incident. She wasn't watching him leave. She wasn't hopping for thanks. She had already moved on. Richard smiled quietly. "I think I just found it." Unseen by either of them, Manager Victor Collins stood in his office watching the entire interaction through the security monitors. His expression darkened. He replayed the footage once, then again. Something about Emily's actions irritated him far more than he cared to admit. In his mind, she hadn't simply bought bread. She had challenged his authority in front of customers. His jaw tightened. A dangerous thought slowly formed. Employees who forget their place, he muttered under his breath, need to be reminded. His cold smile reflected faintly in the security monitor. Outside, Richard climbed into the waiting sedan. As the vehicle pulled away, he looked back one final time. Inside the supermarket, Emily continued working without the slightest idea that the man she had just helped wasn't merely grateful. He was already changing her future. But before fate could reward her kindness, someone else had decided to punish it, and the revenge Victor Collins was planning would leave Emily's life in ruins. Richard Harrison remained silent as the unmarked sedan rolled away from Green Valley Supermarket. The loaf of bread rested on the seat beside him. He barely looked at it. His thoughts were completely occupied by one person, Emily Carter. Thomas Brooks glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Sir?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the window as people hurried along sidewalks, completely unaware that one of the richest men in America was passing beside them. Finally, he spoke. "Thomas." "Yes, sir." "When was the last time someone gave something to me without expecting anything in return?" Thomas thought for several seconds. "I honestly can't remember." Neither could Richard. Over the years, people had offered gifts hopping for business contracts. Others donated to his charities hopping to earn his favor. Some praised him simply because of his wealth. But Emily, she hadn't even known who he was. She had sacrificed the little she possessed for someone she believed would never be able to repay her. That wasn't generosity. That was character. Richard slowly picked up the loaf of bread. A faint smile crossed his face. "She reminded me of Margaret." Thomas looked up again. It was the first time Richard had voluntarily mentioned his late wife in months. Margaret Harrison had possessed the same quiet compassion. She often stopped to help strangers without ever mentioning it afterward. She believed that kindness lost its beauty the moment it became a performance. Richard gently ran his fingers across the paper bag. "I haven't felt this way in years." Thomas understood exactly what Richard meant. Not romantic love, not yet. Something much deeper, hope. For the first time since Margaret's passing, Richard had encountered someone whose heart seemed untouched by selfishness. Thomas quietly made a mental note. Emily Carter was no longer just another supermarket employee. She had become important. Back at Green Valley Supermarket, the atmosphere had returned to normal. Customers continued shopping. Cash registers beeped steadily. Children asked their parents for candy. Life moved forward. Only Emily's stomach reminded her that something had changed. She reached into her pocket during a quiet moment. $11.21. That was all that remained. She mentally calculated the numbers again. Bus fare, medicine, dinner. Something would have to be sacrificed again. She quietly smiled to herself. Figure it out. She always did. Mrs. Lopez noticed Emily staring into her pocket. You all right, sweetheart? Emily quickly nodded. Yes, you look worried. I'm fine. Lopez wasn't convinced. Years of raising children had taught her when someone was hiding pain behind a smile. You know, she said gently, strong people get tired too. Emily smiled. I know. I'll be okay. She meant every word, not because life was easy, because giving up had never been an option. At that same moment, inside the manager's office overlooking the sales floor, Victor Collins replayed the security footage for the fourth time. Every replay irritated him more. He watched Emily step forward. He watched customers turn toward her. He watched the old man thank her. Something about it bothered him deeply. It wasn't the bread. It wasn't the money. It was the attention. In Victor's mind, authority mattered more than fairness. For years, employees had obeyed him without question. He expected that obedience, demanded it. Emily's decision, though compassionate, had unintentionally exposed his lack of compassion in front of dozens of customers. His pride couldn't tolerate that. He leaned back slowly. A memory surfaced. Nearly 15 years earlier, Victor had worked under another supermarket manager. One afternoon, Victor had questioned a decision in front of customers. The senior manager had humiliated him publicly. Later that evening, the older man said something Victor never forgot. If your employees ever challenge your authority, crush it immediately. Victor had carried those words throughout his career. What had once wounded him had quietly transformed him into someone who inflicted the same pain on others. He looked toward the sales floor through the office window. Emily continued cleaning. Completely unaware, Victor picked up the phone. Human Resources. A woman's voice answered. This is Karen. Be submitting an employee disciplinary report. Whom? Emily Carter. Happened. Victor paused, then carefully chose his words. Insubordination. Karen sounded surprised. Emily, she's never had disciplinary issues. Victor's expression hardened. She interfered with management decisions during business hours. Karen hesitated. If that's the case, submit the documentation. I will. Victor slowly hung up. A cold smile spread across his face. The decision had already been made. Emily simply didn't know it yet. Miles away, Richard arrived at Harrison Global Headquarters. The towering glass building reflected the afternoon sunlight. Executives immediately greeted him. Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. Welcome back, sir. He acknowledged them politely before entering the executive elevator. Daniel was already waiting inside his office. How was your adventure? Richard smiled. Interesting. Daniel laughed. That's all. Richard placed the loaf of bread on the desk. I met someone. Daniel noticed something different in his father's eyes, curiosity, warmth, even excitement. Those emotions had almost disappeared after Margaret's death. Happened. Richard sat down, then slowly told the entire story. He described the forgotten wallet, the humiliation, the customers, the cashier, the manager. Finally, he described Emily. Daniel listened without interrupting. When Richard finished, silence filled the office. Then Daniel smiled. Been thinking about her ever since, haven't you? Richard didn't deny it. I can't explain it. You don't have to. Daniel leaned forward. What impressed you the most? Richard answered without hesitation. She hesitated. Daniel looked confused, hesitated. Richard nodded. If she had immediately offered to pay, I would have appreciated her kindness. She didn't, stood there struggling. I could actually see the decision hurting her. That told me something. Daniel remained silent. Richard continued. She needed that money. Wasn't giving away extra cash. Was giving away something she couldn't afford to lose. Daniel slowly nodded. That changes everything. It does. Richard looked toward the city skyline. I want to know who she is. Daniel smiled. I already guessed that. Just then Thomas knocked gently before entering. I have the preliminary report, sir. Richard looked up immediately. So soon? Thomas handed him a folder. Investigators work quickly. Richard opened it. Inside were only basic details. Emily Carter, age 25. Business administration graduate, employed as a cleaner for 19 months, lives with her widowed mother, Linda Carter. No criminal history, no debts beyond ordinary medical expenses. Richard paused at that final sentence, medical expenses. Thomas, Yes, sir. Find out more. Already are. Thomas hesitated before continuing. Our investigator also noticed something else. What? Emily stopped at a pharmacy after work yesterday. Richard frowned. She buy medicine. Thomas lowered his eyes. No, looked at the price. Then quietly walked away. Richard closed the folder slowly, his chest tightened. He suddenly understood why Emily had hesitated before buying the bread. She hadn't been protecting money for herself. She had been protecting money for someone she loved, and she still chose compassion. Richard whispered almost to himself, "What kind of woman does that?" Daniel watched his father carefully. Something extraordinary was happening. Not love. Not yet respect, admiration. The beginning of an emotional connection built on character rather than appearance. It was the strongest possible foundation for anything that might come later. Meanwhile, Emily finally finished her shift. She clocked out and walked toward the neighborhood pharmacy. The pharmacist recognized her immediately. "I'm sorry, Emily." She smiled politely. "I know. I can still hold the prescription until tomorrow morning." Emily looked down at the remaining money inside her purse. It wasn't enough. "Understand. Really trying." "I know you are." Pharmacist sighed sympathetically. "I wish there was more I could do." Emily thanked him before quietly walking away. Outside, she looked toward the evening sky. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, "Please, just let Mom be okay until I figure this out." She had no idea. Someone else had already started trying to figure it out for her. But before Richard Harrison could reach out, Victor Collins intended to strike first. And by tomorrow morning, Emily would lose far more than her money. She was about to lose the only job keeping her little family alive. Emily sat by the window of the city bus, clutching the white termination letter so tightly that the edges had become crumpled. Outside, the city carried on as though nothing had happened. Children laughed on the sidewalks. Businessmen hurried across intersections. A young couple smiled as they shared coffee outside a cafe. Life was moving forward. Only Emily's life had stopped. She looked down at the letter once again. Employment terminated, effective immediately. Those 4 words had destroyed everything she had spent nearly 2 years trying to build. Her fingers slowly drifted into her purse. $11.21. That was all she had left in the world. She silently counted it again. Maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe there was another $20 bill hidden somewhere. There wasn't. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away before anyone could notice. The elderly woman sitting beside her quietly glanced over. "My dear." Emily forced a weak smile. "I'm fine." The old woman smiled sadly. Lived long enough to know that people who cry while saying they're fine usually need someone to listen. Emily wanted to answer. Instead, she simply looked back out the window. If she opened her mouth, she knew she would break. The bus finally stopped. Emily stepped onto the sidewalk and slowly walked toward the old apartment building. Every step felt heavier than the last. She stopped outside the pharmacy. Through the glass window, she could see the familiar pharmacist arranging medicine on the shelves. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then she forced herself inside. The pharmacist looked up immediately. "Emily." She smiled politely. "Sorry. I still don't have enough." Pharmacist sighed. "I kept your mother's prescription aside. I was hopping." Emily slowly shook her head. "I lost my job today." Pharmacist froze. "Fired me." Silence filled the small pharmacy. Finally, the pharmacist quietly removed the prescription from the shelf. "I'm so sorry." Emily nodded. "I understand." She turned toward the door. Just before leaving, the pharmacist spoke again. "Wish kindness paid bills." Emily smiled sadly. "So do I." She walked away without looking back. By the time she reached home, she had already rehearsed 100 different ways to tell her mother. None of them sounded right. She quietly unlocked the apartment door. "Emily?" Linda Carter looked up from the old sofa. "Home early." Smile on her face disappeared the moment she saw Emily's eyes. "What happened?" Emily couldn't speak. She simply handed over the envelope. Linda unfolded it. The room became completely silent. "They fired you." Emily nodded. "I'm sorry, Mom." "I tried," begged him. "I told him about your medicine. I told him I needed the job. Didn't care." Linda immediately embraced her daughter. "No, sweetheart. You have nothing to apologize for." Emily buried her face against her mother's shoulder. "I'm supposed to take care of you. I'm supposed to make your life easier. Everything I touch just falls apart." Linda gently lifted Emily's chin. "Look at me." Emily slowly raised her eyes. "You did not lose your job because you were dishonest. You lost it because you refused to stop being kind. There is a huge difference. Emily cried even harder. I don't know how we're going to survive. Linda smiled through her own tears. We'll survive the same way we always have. Together. An hour later, Emily quietly opened the kitchen cupboard, one small box of pasta, half a bag of rice, 3 cans of soup, nothing else. She checked the refrigerator, a little milk, a few eggs, butter, that was everything. Quietly sat at the kitchen table for the first time in years. Fear finally defeated hope. She lowered her head into her hands. What am I going to do? Just then, someone knocked. Emily quickly wiped away her tears before opening the door. Mrs. Lopez stood there holding 2 grocery bags. I heard. Emily immediately shook her head. No, I can't take this. Lopez smiled. Yesterday you fed a stranger. Today let your neighbors feed you. Emily looked inside the bags. Bread, rice, fresh vegetables, chicken, milk, even Linda's favorite herbal tea. Emily broke down completely. Mrs. Lopez hugged her tightly. No one with a heart like yours should ever feel abandoned. If you're enjoying this story and you'd like to see how Emily's journey unfolds, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and every subscription genuinely helps us continue creating heartfelt stories like this. And let us know in the comments what country you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Later that evening, another knock echoed through the apartment. Emily opened the door this time. It was the landlord, Mr. Douglas. His expression was unusually serious. I'm sorry to bother you. Emily forced a smile. It's okay. He hesitated. Been patient for 3 months. Emily lowered her eyes. I know. The bank is threatening foreclosure on this building. I have no choice anymore. He handed her a folded notice. You have 10 days. Emily stared at the paper. 10 days after that. They would lose their home, she whispered. I understand. Mr. Douglas sighed deeply. I wish there were another way. So do I. After he left, Emily slowly slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. She looked around the tiny apartment. Every memory lived inside these walls. Her father teaching her multiplication at the kitchen table, Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, family photographs. Soon of it might disappear. Linda quietly walked over and sat beside her. Neither woman spoke. Words couldn't solve anything anymore. Across the city, inside Harrison Global Headquarters, Thomas Brooks entered Richard Harrison's office carrying a thick investigation file. We've completed the preliminary investigation. Richard looked up. So soon? Thomas nodded. There was more than we expected. Richard opened the file. Inside were statements from former employees, anonymous complaints, performance reports. Each page painted the same picture. Victor Collins had spent years humiliating employees, threatening them, intimidating them. Some had resigned, some had been fired. Most never reported him because they believed no one would listen. Richard quietly closed the file. This wasn't an isolated incident. No, Thomas answered. It appears Emily is simply his latest victim. Richard walked toward the window overlooking the city. For several moments, he said nothing. Thomas finally asked, what would you like us to do? Richard remained silent. Then he quietly answered, find Emily. Thomas reached for his notebook. What should I tell her? Richard thought carefully, then slowly shook his head. Nothing. Thomas looked surprised. Nothing. Not yet. Why? Richard looked out at the fading sunset. Right now, she doesn't need promises, needs the truth. I won't approach her until I know I can give her justice instead of hope. Thomas quietly nodded. I understand. Richard looked down at the small photograph clipped to Emily's employment file. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, he smiled. Not because he believed fate had brought her into his life, but because he had finally met someone whose kindness reminded him that goodness still existed in the world. Meanwhile, miles away, Emily quietly opened a small wooden box hidden beneath her bed. Inside rested her late father's wristwatch. It was the last thing he had ever given her. She gently held it in both hands. Tears rolled down her face. Tomorrow morning, she would take it to a pawn shop. If selling her father's last gift was the only way to buy her mother's medicine, she would do it. She kissed the watch softly. I'm sorry, Dad. Unknown to Emily, the man whose life she had changed forever had just given one simple instruction: find her. And although Richard Harrison had no intention of rushing into her life, fate was already preparing another meeting. One that neither of them could stop. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of Emily's apartment. She had not slept. The old wristwatch rested on the kitchen table. It had belonged to her father. For years, she had promised herself she would never part with it, not for any amount of money. But promises made during better days often collided with realities no one could control. Emily picked up the watch with both hands. A flash of memory crossed her mind. She was 12 years old again, sitting on her father's shoulders during the town's 4th of July parade. Her father, Michael Carter, laughed as he tapped the watch on his wrist. "One day," he had told her, "this will remind you that time is the most valuable thing you'll ever own. Money comes and goes, but your character stays with you forever." At the time, she hadn't understood those words now. They echoed painfully in her heart. She kissed the watch gently. "I'm sorry, Dad. Get it back somehow." Linda quietly watched from the doorway. She had seen everything. "No," Emily looked up. Linda slowly walked toward her. "Your father wouldn't want you to sell that." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I don't have a choice. Need your medicine. Need food. We're about to lose this apartment." Linda shook her head. "We'll find another way." Emily smiled sadly. "We've been saying that for months." This time, there really wasn't another way. She carefully wrapped the watch in a soft cloth and slipped it into her purse. Neither mother nor daughter realized that someone had been watching the apartment building from a parked sedan across the street since dawn. Thomas Brooks lowered his binoculars. He had arrived an hour earlier, following Richard Harrison's instructions. He wasn't there to interfere, only to observe. Richard had been clear. "Do not approach her until we know everything." Thomas watched as Emily stepped out of the building. She wasn't heading toward a job interview. She wasn't heading to the supermarket. She was walking toward the oldest pawn shop in the city. Thomas frowned. Something wasn't right. He quietly started the car and followed from a distance inside Carter's Pawn and Loan. The smell of old wood and metal filled the room. The elderly owner looked up as Emily entered. "Good morning." Emily forced a smile. "Good morning. What can I help you with?" Emily slowly removed the cloth from her purse. The gold wristwatch caught the morning light. The owner adjusted his glasses. He immediately recognized quality craftsmanship. "May I?" Emily nodded. He carefully examined the watch. His expression changed. "This is beautiful. Belonged to my father. I see." He looked at her kindly. "Are you selling it? Or pawning it?" Emily hesitated. "I'd like to pawn it. I want to buy it back." Old man nodded slowly. "Do my best to help." He checked the mechanism, still working perfectly. He studied the engraving on the back. "To Michael, time never changes a good man." Owner looked back at Emily. "Someone loved your father very much." Emily smiled through tears. "They did." He quietly wrote a number on a small piece of paper. Emily looked at it. Her heart dropped. It was less than half of what she had expected. "I'm sorry. The resale market isn't very strong right now." Emily understood. She nodded. "Take it." Just as she reached for the paperwork, the shop door suddenly opened. Thomas Brooks walked inside. Emily glanced at him briefly before looking away. She had never seen him before. Thomas pretended to browse several antique clocks. His attention, however, remained fixed on the watch. When the owner disappeared into the back office to prepare the receipt, Thomas quietly stepped forward. He looked at the watch, then at Emily. "Family heirloom?" Emily nodded. "My father's." "I'm sorry," she smiled politely. "So am I." Neither said another word. The owner returned. Emily signed the papers. Moments later, she walked out carrying a small envelope of cash. The watch remained behind. Thomas waited until she disappeared down the street. Then he approached the counter. "I'd like to buy that watch." Owner shook his head. "I'm afraid I can't. It's under a pawn agreement." Thomas quietly placed a business card on the counter. "If she doesn't return for it, pay whatever it costs." Owner studied the card. His eyes widened. "Harrison Global." Thomas smiled politely. "Don't tell her." Owner nodded slowly. "I understand." Thomas walked outside. His chest felt unexpectedly heavy. He had investigated hundreds of people during his career. Very few had affected him. Emily was different meanwhile. Richard Harrison sat alone in his office. Margaret's photograph rested on the corner of his desk. He looked at it quietly. "Think you would have liked her?" A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Daniel entered. "Been staring at that picture for 10 minutes. Richard smiled faintly. "I was remembering." Daniel sat opposite him. "You miss Mom?" "Every day." Richard looked toward the city. "But something feels different now." "Do you mean?" Richard hesitated. "When Emily helped me, I didn't just see kindness. I saw the kind of person your mother used to be." Daniel smiled warmly. noticed. Richard quickly added, I'm not replacing Margaret. I know, I'm simply, he searched for the right word. Grateful. Before Daniel could respond, Thomas entered. I found Emily. Richard looked up immediately. And Thomas placed a photograph on the desk, Emily leaving the pawn shop, another photograph, the pawn receipt finally. A close-up picture of the engraved watch. Richard silently studied the images. What happened? Thomas answered quietly. She pawned her late father's watch. Room fell completely silent. Richard slowly closed his eyes. He understood exactly what that meant. People didn't pawn family heirlooms because they wanted extra spending money. They pawned them because life had cornered them. Daniel broke the silence. She must be desperate. Thomas nodded. She is. Richard quietly stood. He walked toward the window. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he softly asked, did she buy the medicine? Thomas lowered his eyes. Yes. Richard smiled for the first time all morning. Good, Thomas continued. But after paying for the medicine, he had less than $40 left. Richard's smile disappeared back at Green Valley Supermarket. Melissa couldn't concentrate. Every aisle reminded her of Emily, every mop bucket, every freshly cleaned floor, every smiling customer. She finally walked into Victor's office. I need to talk. Victor didn't even look up from his computer. Want to withdraw my statement. Victor slowly raised his head. You can't. I lied. No, you signed. Melissa's voice trembled. I did it because you promised me the promotion. Victor smiled coldly, and you'll still get it. Don't want it anymore. Victor stood, his expression darkened. You should think very carefully before making emotional decisions. I'm thinking about Emily. Victor stepped closer. If corporate learns that report was false, you'll be fired too. Melissa froze. Victor continued. You committed fraud. You signed the document. You helped create the evidence. So if I fall, you fall with me. Melissa felt the blood drain from her face. Only then did she understand. The promotion had never been the reward. It had been the bait. She wasn't Victor's partner. She was his insurance policy. Victor calmly sat back down. You may leave. Melissa slowly walked out. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She had betrayed an innocent woman. And in return, she had become trapped inside Victor's web, unknown to both of them. Tyler had been standing just outside the office door. He hadn't heard every word, but he had heard enough. His face turned pale. Melissa lied, he whispered, and Victor knows it. The first time. Someone besides Richard Harrison now held a piece of the truth, and that single piece was about to bring the entire lie crashing down. The next morning, Emily stood outside a small employment agency with a folder tucked tightly beneath her arm. Inside the folder were copies of her college degree, her resume, recommendation letters, and a dream that seemed to be slipping farther away with every passing hour. The receptionist smiled politely. Good morning. How can I help you? Emily returned the smile. Looking for any available office position. Receptionist entered her name into the computer. A few moments later, her smile faded. Sorry. There aren't any openings that match your qualifications. Emily nodded. What about receptionist jobs? I'm afraid those have already been filled. Customer service. The woman shook her head again. Warehouse? Nothing at the moment. Emily thanked her and quietly walked outside. By noon, she had visited 5 more employment agencies. The answer was always the same. We'll call you. She knew they wouldn't. As the afternoon sun beat down, Emily sat on a park bench. Her feet ached. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening. She reached into her purse, $37. That was all she had left after buying her mother's medicine. She looked at the family photograph inside her wallet. I'm trying, Dad. I really am. Across town, inside Harrison Global Headquarters, Thomas Brooks placed another report on Richard Harrison's desk. Investigators confirmed everything. Richard looked up. Victor, Thomas nodded. He falsified corporate records. He edited surveillance footage. Pressured Melissa into signing a false witness statement, buried previous employee complaints. Richard slowly closed the file. For several seconds. He said nothing. Then he asked, how many lives has he ruined? Thomas answered quietly, we've identified 14. Richard leaned back. Then Emily isn't just fighting for herself. No, she's fighting for every employee who stayed silent. Daniel folded his arms. So, what's the plan? Richard looked toward the city skyline. Handle Victor. Thomas smiled. I thought you'd say that. First, Richard continued, I want Emily's father's watch. Thomas nodded. I already arranged it. He placed a small velvet box on Richard's desk. Inside rested Michael Carter's watch, perfectly polished, exactly as Emily remembered it. Richard gently picked it up. He read the engraving. To Michael, time never changes a good man. He quietly smiled. Neither does a good daughter. At Green Valley Supermarket, Victor Collins couldn't stop smiling. Corporate had approved Melissa's promotion exactly as he predicted. He walked onto the sales floor. Congratulations. Melissa forced a smile. Thank you. She felt no happiness, only guilt. Tyler watched everything from a distance. Something still bothered him. Victor wasn't acting like someone afraid of being investigated. He was acting like someone who believed he had already won. Tyler quietly walked into the employee break room. He pulled out his phone. His finger hovered over Emily's number. Should he call her? Should he tell her what he overheard? Before he could decide, his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Hello, a calm voice replied. My name is Thomas Brooks. I work for Harrison Global. Tyler frowned. I think, Thomas interrupted gently. I believe we both want the same thing. Tyler's heartbeat quickened. What is that? Justice for Emily Carter. Tyler looked around to make sure no one was listening. You know about what happened. We know much more than you think. Tyler swallowed hard. Have information. Thomas smiled. So do we? We meet? Yes. Tonight. Meanwhile, Emily returned home carrying another stack of rejection letters. Linda immediately recognized the look on her daughter's face. No luck. Emily smiled weakly. Today, Linda reached for her hand. Tomorrow will be different. Emily wished she believed that just then. Someone knocked on the apartment door. Emily opened it. Standing outside was the elderly pawnshop owner. He smiled warmly. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Emily looked confused. No, I came because something unusual happened. Emily frowned. What do you mean? The old man handed her an envelope. Inside was her pawn ticket. Emily looked up. I don't understand. The old man smiled. This morning, a gentleman came into my shop, paid everything. Emily blinked. What? He redeemed your father's watch. Emily's heart stopped. What? He didn't leave his name. Only gave me instructions. What instructions? The old man reached into his coat pocket. He carefully removed the watch. Emily gasped. Her father's watch. She immediately burst into tears. She gently held it against her chest. I don't understand. The old man handed her a folded handwritten note. He asked me to give you this. Emily slowly unfolded it. It contained only one sentence. Some things are too precious to be sold. Please keep this close to your heart. No signature, no address, no phone number, nothing. Emily looked back at the old man. Who was he? The owner smiled apologetically. He asked me not to tell you. After thanking him repeatedly, Emily closed the door. She stared at the note for a long time, whoever the stranger was. He knew exactly how much the watch meant to her. For the first time since losing her job, hope quietly returned miles away. Richard stood inside the lobby of Harrison Global. He looked at the city lights through the massive glass windows. Thomas approached. Tyler agreed to meet. Richard nodded. And Melissa? Thomas sighed. She's breaking. She wants to tell the truth. Richard remained silent. Thomas continued. But there's something else. Investigators discovered Victor wasn't acting alone. Richard slowly turned around. What do you mean? Thomas handed him another confidential file. Richard opened it. His eyes immediately narrowed. There, printed clearly across several financial records, was the name of someone Richard trusted, someone who had worked inside Harrison Global for nearly 12 years, someone sitting only a few offices away from Richard every single day. Daniel noticed Richard's expression. What is it? Richard slowly looked up. His voice became almost a whisper. This is impossible. Thomas answered quietly. I'm afraid it isn't. They've been helping Victor hide employee complaints for years. Daniel's face turned pale. Who is it? Richard slowly closed the file. No, his voice carried both disbelief and heartbreak. It can't be him. At that exact moment, Richard's office door slowly opened. The very person whose name was inside the file stepped into the room with a warm smile. Richard, you wanted to see me? Richard looked up. Neither Thomas, nor Daniel, nor the man standing in the doorway realized that the next words spoken inside that office would change every single one of their lives. To be continued. If you can't wait to discover who betrayed Richard, how Emily will learn the truth about the mysterious stranger who returned her father's watch, and how Victor Collins' world comes crashing down, let us know by commenting Part 2 below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Help us get to 1,000 subscribers. We can't do it without you. Your comments let us know you're ready for the next chapter of Emily and Richard's unforgettable journey.